Hello and welcome to my first ever YouTube video. I would like to introduce you to the world of the Rotas, a series of horror books spanning over 500 years. The first book in the collection is called the Phantazein, which I'll be reading from today. Set in the 1800s, it is a classic gothic horror. Its intention is to start off slow and then build with suspense and terror towards the end. Each of the books are written in a different timeline, and so I have intentionally written them as though they were written at them times. So this one is a little wordy and a little old-fashioned in the way the people talk, but I did that just to keep you immersed in the scenario. So without further ado, we shall begin the Phantazein.
It was in my youth, at a time when the days were longer and each one was boundlessly different from the last, that I first encountered Bartholomew Postlethwaite. He was an amiable fellow, educated and well informed in an abundance of concerns, from world affairs to many of the sciences which have yet to be comprehensively understood by man as present. Bartholomew had the disposition of a gentleman, and through the years, as our boyish figure and naivety eventually succumbed to the melancholy of age cynicism inherent in one's maturity, one constant remained, during these winding passages of our lives, that which would be of my complete and utter reliance on Bartholomew's succinct objectiveness when discussing any and all whimsical topics which lingered upon my mind. Bartholomew and I had maintained our status as fond companions beyond the stages of mere adulthood and into what can kindly be referred to as the trappings of age. Despite our lives taking each in different directions, or so I had understood, I felt nobody in the world knew him as well as I, and I as well as he. Indeed, there were occasions to be had when the months had embedded into years between our associations, and yet somehow we shared an almost telepathic sense of prescience that allowed us to reconnect whenever one of us had a notion to share some endeavour or reasoning with the other. Often, thoughts of Bartholomew's opinion on some subject or folly would cross my mind, and shortly thereafter, as though telegraphed through the ether, I would receive a letter of invitation to visit, or expect Bartholomew's imminent arrival at my home in Horringer, located some 10 miles west of Cambridge, where we had previously schooled together. Rest assured, dear reader, that no imposition was felt or received in either circumstance, and the times that occupied us between our rendezvous surely contributed to the sense of excitement and anticipation of our next encounter. It was on that very subject of this uncanny sense of mindful entanglement that had been the prelude to the last visit I had from my dearest and most protracted of friends. The notion of this empathic communion, and its proclivity to defy happenstance, occurred to me on a sleepless night, October last, and, suitably, I considered it to be a genial topic of conversation for our next encounter. Needless to say that by the week following, and with great pleasure, I had received a dispatch from Bartholomew advising me to his intent to employ one of the new steel-sprung stagecoaches, delivering him to Moray Hall this coming New Year. He continued to explain that his visit was inspired upon a whim to partake in this invigorating transport evolution. Since the journey time had been so drastically reduced due to its design, he felt sufficient spell had passed from which he could replenish our mutual accounts. He continued to say that the thrill of a swift journey was, as he phrased, irresistible, and that he could think of no better excuse to resume our acquaintance. As I read this communication, I could not contain my incredulities of this occurrence, as other than my restless night, it had been 3 years and unmeasured months for least since last I had occasion to bring Bartholomew to my forethought, and, as though prophetic mechanisms had employed to define circumstance, once again the prescribed news had contributed to the preponderance of support in my observations. I quickly detailed in my diary the receipt of the letter, and recalled along with it the few days which had passed since my notion. I feel at pains to express how irritated I was that I had not made the additional effort to record it upon the relevant day. I had considered appending it postscript to the page which detailed the evening of my inclination, but upon consideration I determined that to be dishonest to the integrity of my diary, which otherwise had been meticulously chronicled. Bartholomew arrived on the morning of January the 26th. It was a bitterly cold midwinter day, and the morning dew had aired into a blanketed mist which stretched courteously out across the fields beyond to the fells which preceded the Saxham estate. Frost had gathered from the ground as a deluge to the dawn which welcomed a new sun, and the golden crown adorned the yonder clouds in profile, deceiving their eyes that their sober hueless grey had raised itself into a regal blue which graced majesty itself. I stood with great anticipation in the doorway, barely finding the enthusiasm normally presented to rush forward and embrace my friend, due to the overwhelming frost. I was alerted to my most anticipated guest's approach by the dogs while I replenished logs for the fire. My creature companions had begun to behave in an excitable manner. Surprise still affected me despite the anticipation, which had already fared the better of me many times that morn, and my persistent gazes as far as horizon's reach, while calling for expedition, had yet to hasten my good friend's approach. Salient of Bartholomew's appearance, as the carriage door opened at the industry of his driver, were numerous changes that contradicted any memory of him. While it is entirely possible, and indeed likely, that an individual may become portly with indulgence towards a dishonest comfortable living, or lean due to the malady of an honest but uncomfortable regime, I had no explanation for how Bartholomew's entire stature had become not only significantly slighter than I recalled, but also between 4 and 6 inches shorter. I felt sure that my perplexity had made little disguise of itself upon my face, but Bartholomew's smile as he reached out to embrace me was as familiar a sign of warm greeting as it had always been, yet within me I still felt a wry sense of his acknowledgement of his as yet unspoken transmogrification. Feeling it unbecoming to initiate our meeting with such an impolite questioning of the matter, I resisted my intense intrigue and performed my gentlemanly duty as a goodly host by leading Bartholomew directly into Moray, the name of my estate and home. The driver, a stout man of proletarian demeanour in accordance with his duties, had carried Bartholomew's trunk ahead of us as far as the vestibule. As he began to set it down, I intended to instruct him without any uncertainty to carry the trunk to the room which I had ensured was prepared for his master. However, before I could give my instructions comprehensively and inform him without word or by of your leave, he released the trunk with careless beat upon the ground and began to make his retreat. This said, I must confess I was less astonished by the effrontery of the driver than by the ferocity of Bartholomew's reaction to his man as he made haste past us in retreat. It may be that I had not paid sufficient attention before, or did not care to take note from where Bartholomew had produced the cane by which he bore down on the driver in an explosion of intense agitation. But by the time the driver had fled forthwith to his carriage and sped in fear for his life back along the pathway and yonder to the roadway, I have little doubt that no insignificant amount of blood had been drawn from the man's back in that rebuke administered by Bartholomew. Regaining composition, Bartholomew's rants of impudence and insolence towards that now flown coachman
had pacified into appeals of accordance with the nature of my friend's brutal administration. This manner of man, his aspect and temperament were both familiar and queer to me at one time. Choosing discretion once again as the civil course of action, I felt uneasy about extending the same level of welcome to this familiar stranger that had been customary throughout our friendship. In an attempt to resume familiarity, I explained that Mrs. Mason, the lady who takes care of my household, usually visits on weekdays from mid-morning to evening to tend to cooking, laundry, and general housekeeping. She would be with us to prepare a feast worthy of his welcome. However, presently, I only had wine, cheese, and bread, if he required replenishment sooner. I also promised to inquire about Mrs. Mason's husband, whom I had previously hired for additional labour. Mr. Mason would make short work of relocating the trunk, and, until then, it would remain in its present location. We sat for the remainder of the morning, observing the mist dissipate while reminiscing and recounting our previous conversations and adventures. Often, as acquaintances do, we repeated some of our most familiar and convivial stories, and this indulgence seemed to set aside the concerns that had crafted themselves immediately upon his arrival. Shortly thereafter, I broached the topic of my observations, to wit, the concordance and regularity from which my thoughts of him had so often resulted in the manifestation of our occasions being beyond mere happenstance. He generally concurred with the notion that the frequency of such coincidences were unlikely considered such. Being a scholar of the seminaries of arcane knowledge, he often felt dismissed in the modernity of an English enterprise. Of late, he has favoured the industrious customs of man's labour over those of the mystical persuasions. Despite this, that day he indulged my curiosity, and continued to relate tales of whose origins that had the distinct flavour of a generally more southeastern influence. He spoke of a mystical form of light which he called the phosphine, a substance somewhat pertinent to the manifestation of shared inclinations concordant with my whimsical intrigue. He expressed that he had spent some time with a Swami in India while helping with the funding of Dhaka College, specifically in Bangladesh. The Swami had relayed to him over a considerable period of time the process by which one could combine multiple mystical disciplines to manifest a mode of celestial transportation at unbound speed across oceans if one wished, projecting, as he described, an image, a thought, or even a scenario from which one person's mind to the next, regardless of the distance between them, could be transmitted. He also mentioned that through persistent and focused application, one could create a full telepathic communication between any two persons in the world, whether they are willing participants or not. He described how the constituent called phosphine was employed generally amongst all living creatures as a method by which correspondence of the light that is received by the eyes may further pass into the solids of the body and into the mind along the mental pathways in which light in its natural state simply cannot exist. He explained that with its hue and intensity, phosphine is a construct such as a parcel of information interpreted by the mind's single eye, which collaborates into the amalgamation of all stimuli of the senses. I'm at pains to admit that I was barely clinging on to the threads of what he meant. However, uninterrupted, he continued to explain to me, in what he considered to be the simplest of terms, his intent. "My dear fellow," he said, "when you close thine eyes, light is interrupted on its path, rendering the observer all but blind, is it not?" To which I readily agreed. Likewise, light received against the receptors inside the eye must surely halt without further conduit through transparent medium, in which light may pass, yet somehow this imagery is carried by the vessels of the mind into the forethought of your being. What, then, is the light you see in a dream without such optical stimuli? Why, imagination, I speculated. Indeed it is, but only to a degree. Does that imagination not also include sound and sometimes presence? He offered in supplementary consideration. Then also consider this. How does imagination have such hues and intensity which are also present in natural light? Surely the word imagination offers itself to the presence of an insubstantial nation, which is made but purely of artificial imagery without practical cause or genuine light stimulus. And is that not of the substance which the real world contributes to that observation? Furthermore, if it is without source of substance, then it is without physical origin. We must conclude that without a source of substance, then the entire imagination is a thing which has presence without initiation in the material universe. And yet, what of the light itself? While it is without substance, it is a projection, or a reflection, if you like, of one's surrounding environment, rather than the matter of substance itself, which continues to place itself upon the eye for us to see. So it must at some point transform into a new version of light, which is capable of traversing the mind's own solid materials. We call that transformative light phosphine. Phosphine, therefore, cannot be subject to the laws of natural light, yet comprises of the same information. Finding my scientific understanding being rudimentary at best, without the wherewithal to presently rebuke, I was compelled to concur. Damnable conversation, Bartholomew. A drink, perhaps? Whiskey? I felt I had to breach the topic before it overwhelmed me. But it was almost as though Bartholomew was enchanted with his own excitable explanation, which lost coherence in the enthusiasm somewhat, and my ruse to break his process of thought paused, if only for the moment, to reply with some congeniality. Yet I could see he was eager to get all the politeness done with so that he could resume his explanation. No, Bartholomew replied before returning as though uninterrupted. Now, during the process of transmuting light itself into phosphine, there must be an intermediary agency in which the notion of that information is both light and phosphine as one. Again, I had not the scientific wherewithal to offer contrary debate, and Bartholomew's reasoning, which I have never found cause to doubt prior, seemed very well considered. I proposed to you that the Swami had mastered that capability to project his imagination into that very intermediary, facilitating the subjacent vision of that imagination into a form that could be shared between one mind and another. Does that sound too incredible? How would that be achieved? I inquired. Simple discipline, Bart responded. One can focus the eye at varying distances, can one not? So one can, with suitable practice, modify the boundaries of the mind by which light must be transmuted into phosphine, and by shifting that very focal point, one creates a wider Phantazein, he excitedly concluded for me. Phantazein, I inquired. Apologies. The spectral phantasm. Phantazein is a word fallen from common parlance. It is suited greatly to the essential substance that is vision, originating from the word phant, meaning to show. Phant is especially applicable to the concerns showing a figment of imagination, Bartholomew added. This moment, hitherto uninterrupted, was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Mason, and subsequently yielded to her imposition, sufficient to break the engagement of conversation. A relief to my curdling composition. Mr. Asquith, why is there a lumbering great crate in front of the doorway? At this point, in an unexpected distraction, Mrs. Mason interrupted herself upon finding my present company. "Oh, I be begging your pardon, kind sirs," she said apologetically. "Think nothing of it, Mrs. Mason, if you please. Permit me to introduce you. This is my friend Bartholomew Postlethwaite, visiting for—" I paused, realising that we had not detailed the duration of his stay, and, with dalliance, I had encumbered myself with the predicament of being without ready conclusion to my statement. "A few days at the most," Bartholomew proffered on my behalf. "Quite. And Bartholomew, this is Mrs. Mason of my employ, of whom I mentioned earlier. Mrs. Mason, I wonder if you would be so kind as to inquire if Mr. Mason could pay us a visit. Mr. Postlethwaite's luggage requires transfer to the guest room, post-haste." "Shall I fetch him straight away?" she inquired. "Yes, please," I confirmed, turning my address back to Bartholomew. "It is little more than a 10-minute walk, I assure you. We will have you settled in your room within the hour." "Would it meet with your approval for Mrs. Mason to unpack for you?" I asked. "No, not at all," Bartholomew insisted. "I hold some rather delicate artifacts acquired from my travels in India that I wanted to show you. I hope Mrs. Mason would not incur great offence with my reticence to allow superfluous hands upon them." "How intriguing," I exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "Maybe tomorrow, once you have found yourself." "Ideal," he agreed. At the time, his perseverance in rejecting my offerings of assistance and foodstuff did not strike me as unusual. However, in hindsight and upon consideration of the usual course of our reunions, there were subtle inclinations that were out of place. At the time, I suppose, I had dismissed them out of hand. Subconsciously, to my present mind, it is entirely possible that the accelerated travel meant that Bartholomew had been satisfied before commencing the final leg of his journey, and that only a couple of hours may have transpired since he partook of sustenance. This did not prevent me from seeking light respite. For a moment, I had lost Bartholomew in my efforts to provision light food on hand for our afternoon. Moray, a house of some 3 stories and 17 rooms, and ample grounds had been susceptible to hiding folk who separate for even the briefest of moments, and, as Bartholomew had always been able to treat my home as his own, it was far from unusual to have to wander betwixt rooms to find one another again. Mr. Mason, accompanied by his goodly wife, arrived at my distraction. Without delay, I instructed him to take the trunk to the guest room. As it was of sound structure and significant weight, he did not make light work of it, unlike Bartholomew's driver beforehand. Despite my standing, I engaged to help Mr. Mason carry the casket upstairs to avoid the discomfiture of having my guest's luggage unceremoniously couried across the hardened tile bedding of the vestibule and up the stairwell. It would have otherwise sustained minor but embarrassing damage to its casework had Mr. Mason persisted alone. It did not go unnoticed to me that Mr. Mason, appropriate to his name, had eyed with significant duration the ornate but unsubtle designs conducive to the symbols whose depth of meaning was fluid to those gentlemen of his namesake's Masonic brethren. While we hauled the trunk to its temporary destination, I myself could not confess to being in such a fraternity. However, Bartholomew had found his extensible jaunts across the continents greatly benefited from the Brotherhood's hospitality afforded to him by such lodges. Without fear of discretion on my part, I observed that his tongue often found occasion too frequent to leave those present to his company in any speculation of that convenience. To be concise, he did not make any secret of his affiliation in my presence, as one would expect. Therefore, I feel not without remit to convey that it was common knowledge. That evening, Bartholomew's demeanour was dour, and throughout which, in earnest, I had made several attempts to heighten congeniality. While often my attempts were met with immediate but short-lived satisfaction, the persistence to which I felt required to bring about my old friend's usual ambient nature was laboured to the point of exasperation. Indeed, for the first and only memories of such emotion within myself, while blessed with Bart's company, I was eager for the night to draw to its natural conclusion, with the hope that the following morning would reinvigorate his natural disposition. It was then that Bartholomew excited my imagination with further fantastical retellings of his mystical understandings. "My dear friend," he always began when he had something that required optimal open-minded deliberation, "consider once again astral projection. It is a curious phenomenon that has captured the imagination of many a curious mind. It is a journey beyond the bounds of our physical realm, whereby the spirit can roam free and unfettered by the constraints of the flesh. One might think of it as a sort of a waking dream, where the mind takes flight and travels to distant lands, encountering sights and sounds that are beyond our ordinary perception. It is a journey that is both exhilarating and mysterious, a realm where the impossible becomes possible, and the mind is free to explore the furthest reaches of the universe. And yet, like the great mysteries, astral projection remains shrouded in a veil of uncertainty and speculation. Some say it's merely a figment of the imagination, a trick of the mind that leads us down a path of self-delusion. Others claim that it is a doorway, a world beyond our own, a realm of spirits and otherworldly beings that can only be accessed through the power of the human spirit. But whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: astral projection is a journey that can only be undertaken by those with a bold and adventurous spirit. For those who dare venture forth into this mysterious realm, the rewards are many and varied, and the experience is sure to be one that will remain with them for a lifetime. Now consider this newly adopted mystical perseverance, which has been coined remote viewing. This is another intriguing phenomenon that has captured the attention of many a curious minds such as your own. It is a method for gaining information about a distant or unseen target through the use of extrasensory perception or mystical abilities. Unlike astral projection, remote viewing usually does not involve leaving one's physical body or travelling to another realm. Instead, it is a mental exercise that allows one to perceive information about a remote target using only the notions of the mind. Some claim that remote viewing is a skill that can be developed through training and practice, while others view it as an innate ability that is present in all humans. Skeptics argue there is no scientific evidence to support its effectiveness, while proponents claim that it has been used successfully in a variety of real-world applications. Ultimately, both astral projection and remote viewing offer tantalizing glimpses into the mysteries of the human mind and the nature of reality itself. Whether one is exploring the furthest reaches of the universe through astral projection, or peering into the secrets of the unknown through remote viewing, both experiences offer the promise of a world beyond our everyday perceptions and a glimpse into the infinite possibilities that lie beyond. While the concepts of astral projection and remote viewing are distinct, they share some commonalities that can potentially result in explaining how a ghost of a living person might be possible. If we combine these ideas with the concept of an apparition, we can begin to see how it might be possible for the spirit or consciousness of a living person to manifest as a ghostly presence. Perhaps, in certain circumstances, a person's consciousness can become detached from their physical body and take on a spectral form that is visible to others. And this then takes on the attributes I mentioned earlier. A Phantazein so vivid it appears as a ghostly presence to those who witness it. As time passed and the hearth consumed its logs and air, we witnessed the first snowfall of the year gently settling outside our window. We were drawn to the sight of a blood moon, larger than any we had seen before, resting above the treetops. The night was illuminated by a polarized glow, and as the snow accumulated on the grounds of Moray Hall, the sky glowed with a warm orange hue. In the darkness of the night, we engaged in deep conversations, as the stunning beauty of our surroundings served as a delightful distraction, and I was joyful of my contentment. "Rahu seeks his revenge," Bartholomew declared in a moment of abstract contemplation, while the whiskies warmed our composition. Taking smoking pipes and retiring whiskies into the courtyard, "I met a Scotsman," Bart mused, as the silence resolved all previous dialogue and demanded new ponderance to reflect the changing venue. "And every time I drink scotch, I'm forcefully taken to his passion." He rubbed his chin and scoffed, shaking his head in amusement. "In what way?" I asked. "See now, this man took great pride in his national drink, and now it seems I cannot simply partake of it henceforth without considering his instructions on how a Scotsman derives a more serious experience to the pleasures that we English could not possibly appreciate." "One of your brethren, I assume?" A knowing, genuine smile exposed his teeth slightly before he forced his lips closed. Examining his expression that had now become an extension of our communications, I considered this momentary change in such an inconsequential discussion a part of a deep-held conviction, an almost impulsive response to be more greatly considered in his manner when any such discussion even touched upon the edges of that fraternity. His eyes rolled up as though contemplating the limits of his next few lines, before the smile, this time not quite so natural, returned. "Yes, quite, yes, well, really, it seems the correct way to appreciate whiskey is akin to that of a wine connoisseur. Would you care to know more?" "Continue, please. Anything that helps me value a whiskey more than my already vast appreciation is, of course, a melody to mine ears." With demonstration, he continued, "Take a good sniff of your whiskey, try to appreciate the notes, and remember them as individuals." "I do so." "Cup your glass with both hands, rubbing the glass. There's a great science to this, he assures me. The Scotsman, that is. But he smiles in such a way that I believe he surely must be setting me up for a fall in jest. But I do as instructed further, and with great seriousness. We are warming the libration through the act of friction. The heat produced by this act causes the beverage's particles to expand. And, in doing so, he said, it gives you more whiskey." I look up from my glass with eyes alone, as to indicate a fainted displeasure in his mockery. My wry smile was met with his of equal proportion. "Bart, you cad, you ribbed me. I was taking thee in all seriousness." "I do," he laughed. "But no, please, I beg you, continue to rub. There is a purpose to our folly." To the same principles of the steam engine, this action does indeed expand the particles of the whiskey, and that expansion thus releases further aromas, notes, and flavours, which are otherwise trapped inside. Science! It is the validation of magic, is it not? He didn't wait for me to answer. "Now smell it." Indeed, I could not argue. "Well, I'll be damned," I exclaimed. The stale bottle seemed reinvigorated. I appreciated the lesson.
To Scotsmen, may they continue to purify water, I charged.
We couldn't resist taking in the fresh air that lured us into the night's splendour. We stood fascinated by it for at least half an hour before the cold became unbearable and we rushed back into the warmth beside the hearth. This gratifying stillness seemed to break up the previously difficult silence, and I considered that maybe my persistent demand for cordiality was potentially the conductor of the said difficult absence of conversation earlier. We enjoyed the mere majesty of the quiet of the evening as long as we could before retiring for the night. During the night, I was disturbed frequently by the motions of my guests. Being for the most part unfamiliar as I am with company and residence, I sought to dismiss the sounds as the common thrashings of a person seeking ease in unaccustomed surroundings and washroom visits, despite the regularity of Bart's stays. However, one sound could not be described in any way as natural in its territory, that being the sound which often in rural parts would be accredited to foxes coupling or ladies in displeasure. Yet neither could be conducive to the setting of their present origin, that being the guest room which had been allocated to Bartholomew. With cautious expedition, I navigated without candle to Bartholomew's room. "Bartholomew," I inexplicably cautioned in lower tone, so as not to cause him distress if none were present. Yet I could hardly contain my own curiosity and concern as I approached the door. I felt compelled to hurry into the room if no response was forthcoming. But, reticent to breach of the privacy of my good fellow's rest, and to the disheartening of my spirit, yet still no response was returned. I knocked timidly, as by now the house was in complete silence, and I began to doubt if the sound had been of earthly origin, or merely the product of my swooning encouragement as I treaded lightly into slumber. "Bartholomew!" I extended a second time, as I knocked firmly with increased concern. "Bart, old man, I'm entering. Forgive me if I intrude, but I feel compelled to act upon an unholy sound which seemed to me was emanated from one's room, and I have concerns for thy well-being." Without further hesitation, I grasped the handle, which, despite my understanding, burned like ice to the touch for a moment, and so I sprang the lock as quickly as I could before release. Pushing the door open, I was not relieved nor pleasured to see the curtains were fully drawn, and thereby offering no further illumination into the room than I had present in the landing from which I was standing. I must return for my candelabrum, were my immediate thoughts. My second thoughts lay way to that of another unrequited "Bartholomew? Art you well?" Without a third thought, I returned expressly to my own room and reached for the candelabrum near side of my bed, which by now was down to little more than 1 inch of a single remaining stub from the pile of candles which had normally situated it. I cupped my hand ahead of the flame to protect it from the rush of wind caused by my momentum, and as quickly as I could, judging by the flame's tilt from which it clung to life, I returned hastily to the guest room. The door was still open, and I could hear the wind howling in a most fearful manner. When I entered, I caught a glimpse of a face of horror in the far corner of the room. My limited vocabulary fails to describe it fully, except for its intense white eyes that remained steadfast in a writhing face of dark motion. The figure, manlike, yet every inch of its shadow frame writhed and moved as if made from insubstantial black pitch. I could not focus on it as I could the immediate environment surrounding it. Either its shadow or its very form motioned up to the far corner of the ceiling, its arms stretched like substantial shadows before me, reaching out, coming to claim my soul. In the moments before I could scream in terror, I found cause to inhale, and on that instant of that intake of breath, instead of my own scream, the face, barely illuminated, screamed inextensibly louder than one could imagine, and shriller than any human ever possibly could summon. The sound bellowed with the force of a banshee's cry, and tiny black festering of material sped towards me from every part of its form. The candle's flame too thundered towards me with vicious intent. Flames and heat enveloped my eyes, blinding me to all but ubiquitous light which surrounded all that I knew. The heat accompanying this burst of illumination was sufficient to curl my eyelashes and leave me browless and alert to the unmistakable smell of burned hair which crammed my nostrils and tempered my lungs before going out as quickly as it had manifest, rendering me once again in complete and utter darkness and reliant upon only sound as the extent of my operable senses. Little use that it was, for I could hear only ringing and buzzing in all directions. As though all time was at one instant, I fell backwards with unpronounced purpose, as though my mind had not the time to convey the need to flee down to the lower portion of my body at the equal rate to which it conveyed to the upper portion. As such, I found myself hurtling back in blind fear, kicking the very ground, while I pushed myself unceremoniously upon my rear quarter as quickly as I ever had been compelled to find motion. My skin crawled as I felt an inundation of things which are of nightmares crawling over every inch of my body. From toe to top, I felt these tiny unseen creatures entering under my nightrobes, testing my very nerves, marching as though with purpose to my most private of orifices and beyond. Up further to my neck, to my ears, my nostrils, and as quickly as I could brush them away, they were back, exactly where they had previously been. My God, they're trying to get into my eyelids. Arms flailing in an attempt to retreat to the furthermost walls, farthest away from my doorway that the structure of my landing would permit. I beat myself down, feeling a swarm of tiny creatures drop away, only to be replenished by more within mere moments that could not account for a single second. I took moments of straining my eyes to see with only the sangreal moonlight which shone through the stained glass. What manner of insect had plagued itself upon me? But the light was only sufficient to make out the door itself as it slammed shut in front of my very eyes, seemingly thrown by the force of God's will itself, and with that, my skin and the surroundings were clear of such beasts. After the few moments which I had to compose myself to the extent that my terrified mind would let me, I reached once again for the candelabra, which I had no recollection of dropping in the urgency of the horrific moment. Blessingly, it had found itself just 2 yards short of my stopping point. Once seized, trembling uncontrollably, I held it outreached between myself and the guest room door as my only weapon or shield, for the guest room door was now as fearsome to me as the devil himself. And though it may in hindsight be considered a barrier between this despairing soul and the wailing being, the once familiar door was little more than a willing portal to my ungodly fears. Pray God it should move or creak, or should that handle at this very moment be turned in any way, then I do not think my horrified mind could ever resolve again to its former reasoning, if indeed it had faint hope of such restoration already. Lord bless me. Lord save thy fearful soldier. Bless me, O Lord. Bless thy humble servant. Save me. Oh, save this humble soul, I beg thee, Lord. It was those words in very manner that were all I could conjure to mind for the remainder of my waking memories. And in the name of God I here testify that I repeated them relentlessly and without cessation for the remainder of the night. I had convinced myself that I dare not allow any other wilful thoughts even stray one single syllable out with that mantra for the sake of salvation of my internal soul. I was neither awake nor asleep come Thursday midday when Mrs. Mason found me still clutching to my candelabra, to my great shame in a pool of my own making. Mrs. Mason later informed me that I remained staring without blinking intently as though petrified at the guest room door. For a brief but not unconsiderable moment she feared that I may be dead. as not an inflection nor breath gave rise to my being of one of the living. Flies, I said. It was made of flies.
Well, thank you for staying till the end of this video. That was the first chapter in the Phantazein. I hope you're not disappointed and that you are enthused with the story, and hopefully you will go to Amazon and buy the book so that you can carry on the story. That's not to say that's the end of these recordings. I will no doubt produce further recordings which carry on the story and hopefully the other books. But for now, that's all you're going to get. Hope you liked it, and oh, thank you for staying. Thank you so very, very much. I hope it was worth the slow start.